which James has just talked about. Fraud by vendors and sellers, and payments fraud. And it's those last two we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail shortly. We're not going to cover a lot of cyber fraud today, just because that topic really needs its own session. But from that, we know in the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners said in their 2020 report to the nations, they found that some fraud risks are actually higher for smaller businesses. So billing fraud is twice as high, and payments tampering fraud is 4 times as high in smaller businesses than large. And that could be a number of reasons, usually because of lack of more documented systems and processes is usually a good contributor to those sorts of things. On the domestic front, the Australian Institute of Criminology reported increases in external fraud in both size and number between 2018 and 2020. And the PwC Global Economic Crime and Fraud Survey reported that in Australian businesses, 56% of all fraud comes from external related fraud, and another 13% comes from collusion, which is collusion and fraud from both involving both internal and external parties. So it's actually not a very rosy picture at the moment, particularly for organisations that don't have fraud either on their radar or documented in their risk register.
Yeah, and I was going to say the important distinction to make here is that you've got corruption and fraud have got very different definitions under this updated standard. And so corruption being dishonest activity in which a person associated with an organisation abuses a position of trust and acts contrary to the interests of the organisation. That's the corruption definition. Whereas fraud is about dishonest activity, as Bronwyn alluded to, causing loss or gain to persons or organisations. And that includes both tangible physical assets and intangible assets such as IP, et cetera, et cetera.
So when we have a think about what are some types of external fraud, probably the top 3 to focus on here are the 3 on the deck there: fake invoices, payment redirection, and asset misappropriation. Because everyone who, you've only got to open up the newspaper every day and you'll see any number of organisations incurring loss through any number of these, and they can be smaller not-for-profits, they can be large organisations. I mean, just have a think about what was reported recently with Westpac and the Forum Group, and that all involved contractor leasing of products and goods and fake invoices. So there's a whole load of stuff that can go on for large and small organisations. So fake invoices and fake billing, this is when fraudsters get businesses to pay for something that they didn't actually order. And sometimes it can be dressed up to look like a legitimate renewal, like a renewal of a subscription or maybe a domain name. So fraudsters usually prey on larger organisations, and they hope that admin and accounts are not really checking invoices, but that they're just paying them. So admin and accounts don't know whether these goods and services have been received or not. So they're hoping that they will just pay for it. And we talked before about teams not physically being together anymore. And so some of the breakdowns here can come from, you can't just wander over to accounts anymore, or you can't just wander over to sales and go, well, did you get those posters? Did you get that book? Like whatever it was. So there's this kind of breakdown because we're not actually working together anymore. So some of those things that we would normally do aren't happening. And that allows these fake invoices and fake billing to propagate there. Usually the fraudsters will contact an organisation via email or sometimes phone call. They can be very insistent and they can be very intimidating. So they hope that if they be intimidating, you'll just pay the invoice and be done with it. So less checking and just get on and get this angry person away from me, and that you will pay the invoice. So the second one there is called payment redirection. So this involves the diverting of invoices. And the Australian Institute of Criminology reported that this type of fraud cost Australian businesses $128 million in 2020. So these are not small amounts of money that we're talking about. So most commonly, scammers will contact the business. They will be impersonating a known business to the organisation, and they'll request that an upcoming payment or invoice be redirected to a different bank account. Okay, so, and there's also been more recently reports of emails being intercepted, where the invoice is then doctored and then the email is on-forwarded to the organisation. So there's a few different ways in payment redirection that can happen. And so what that means is then the money ends up in the fraudster's account and not the person that actually provided the goods or services. And there's a lot of losers here because the organisation paying loses and the organisation, the legitimate organisation that was receiving, also lose. So, you know, that's not a good situation to be in. And then the last one we wanted to talk about here was asset misappropriation. So this involves the unauthorised use or loss associated with business assets. It could be equipment, machinery, it can be resources, it could be cash, it could be payment cards. So the corporate cards that organisations use, the lost and stolen cards, and so, you know, unauthorised use of the cards. This can often involve collusion between both internal and external parties. So sometimes if there's, for example, large amounts of machinery going to go missing, usually someone on the inside is telling someone on the outside what's going to go on or how things happen in my organisation. And therefore, on this basis, we all know on Sunday, no one's around, for example, and these sorts of things. So there's often a lot of collusion that will go on in asset misappropriation. So that's probably just the top three examples of external fraud that all organisations can be susceptible to, both large and small.
Okay, so what actions can businesses take? Because I know for a lot of us sitting in the audience today, certainly that aren't here and are more broadly part of the community of risk management, the standards, I'm sure we'd all agree, can feel a little bit like same all the time. Like they really just kind of go through this repetitive process of saying, do a risk assessment, create a framework, but then you sit there and you go, okay, so what does that actually mean? What can we actually do? Working with a lot of charities and not-for-profits in Australia, certainly I think it's really important, as Bronwyn had alluded to, firstly, even just getting the concept or the risk event of fraud on your risk register at a board level within your organisation, or operationally if you don't have a board of directors, mainly because I think we continue to be amazed, don't we, Bron, that the amount of organisations that go, no, fraud had never happened here. And it's like, yes, it would, because even if you're
we hear it a lot. You know, particularly the smaller sort of the not-for-profits, they're very susceptible to fraud events, and they do often they don't really think about it as having something that you should be doing a risk assessment for, because they're very trusting. Like, oh, well, that won't happen here, and you know that couldn't possibly happen. And you know, the concept of having fraud on your risk register is not something that people want to entertain.
That's right. And certainly, as Bron alluded to, the smaller they are, the more that tends to pervade. So, you know, I can think of the last 2 years working with a couple of football and sport related foundations that have come up from grassroots quite recently, and them having absolutely no conceptual understanding that fraud might be a risk issue for them, despite the fact that they're now sitting on top of a bank account with $11 million, you know, tax-free cash sitting in it or something like that. So look, what can we actually do with all this, you know, standard jargon, which tends to just be there? First and foremost, you do need to look at undertaking a fraud risk assessment. I know it is sort of, you know, same, but then obviously you do the risk assessment, you put risk controls in place, you train people on how those controls are to be enacted. And obviously that includes your assurance processes to check that the controls you think are in place. So we don't need to restate that to you. Code of conduct and expectations and standard are really clearly and sort of, you know, intermeshed in this. And so code of conduct policies, which include things such as our wonderful mate, Charles, talked about last year, the infamous whistleblower policy or framework, they need to be in place, and they're a really strong risk control to try and navigate and prevent this type of internal fraud. So having a culture of speaking out and speaking up. And as we said, monitoring and assurance systems to make sure that what you think's happening is actually happening, and ongoing staff training and, I guess, you know, reinforcement and leadership. Because again, going back to the organisations we see do this really well, there's a very strong leadership message set at the top, usually by the CEO and or the chair of the board, that they want to create a culture of speaking up and speaking out about, you know, things that just don't feel right in the organization, rather than just letting them blow on by. And I know Rupert can probably regale us with a million stories from working in all those different sort of Southeast Asian jurisdictions about what goes on, and in terms of that fear that a lot of organizations or employees have to report, you know, what they might perceive as fraudulent or corrupt activity. All right, back to you, Bron.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. You just stay on that last slide then for a minute. I just want to talk to a couple of things here, because what was really interesting when James and I were putting our business insurance arrangements in place earlier this year, and it comes down to the processes and procedures that you have in place when changes to bank accounts are required. And so insurance companies were asking, when we were talking about our risk framework, they were wanting to know, what arrangements do you have in place for, you know, multi-factor authentication for these kinds of things. So, you know, having documented procedures for when billers, you know, people are wanting to change bank accounts, I think is really important. And it wasn't really something that we had thought too much about, but obviously everyone's across the payment redirection thing now, and, you know, even the insurance companies. You really want to limit the number of people that have delegations to pay and authorise accounts as well. So you really want to have those sort of stricter processes in place, particularly if it comes to large sums of money, and making sure that you've got all your dates, you're across your dates for all renewals and those sorts of things, in case, you know, one of those things slips by. You don't, you know, want to be paying for things and then you find out, oh, well, actually that wasn't due for another 6 months, and or maybe that one was a fake. So having some of these things documented and in place, and really good procedures around how you manage money, invoicing, payments and processes. And then on the physical side of things, making sure that you've got physical access, security and systems in place for your workplace and work sites, particularly in COVID, as we're going through shut down, open up, close down and those sorts of things. You want to make sure that physical access to your site is limited and is tightly controlled. Thanks, James.
No worries. Okay, so oops, got this next one, and then we go to some interaction. So the key messages that we want you to take away from that standard are that, you know, no surprises, pardon me, risk management is essential. You need to establish, we missed a word there, a fraud and corruption control framework is what I actually accidentally dropped off there, which includes a prevention strategy, early detection systems, including KRIs, I'll talk about those shortly just in a moment, and effective response procedures. So again, it is that sort of, you know, if the majority of standards these days kind of fall or kind of come off that framework of the ISO 9001 quality management system standard that has this sort of 4-point plan, do, check, act Deming cycle, this is again akin to one of those very similar messages that comes out that, you know, do a risk assessment, put controls in place, monitor those controls, monitor that they're working, continuous improvement, start the cycle again. And I think one of the more helpful pieces of the standard, again, because I am a bit of a cynic on these standards because I feel like they all just talk the same stuff generically over and over again, is if you jump into the appendix sections, there's some really good key risk indicators. And I think for anyone that's worked with businesses that run effective key risk indicators currently or have in the past, and we'd love to hear in the discussion about that, they to us would be one of the really great mechanisms you can put in place to actually look at what's happening in your organization. And so to pull a couple out of that appendix that I thought were really pertinent to this discussion is one of the suggested KRIs or key risk indicators that they believe you should have in place in this fraud and corruption control framework is some sort of a metric around the whistleblower reporting system versus the time taken to close out complaints provided to that system. So what they're really saying there is, you know, if you've got an organization that's either leaves a lot of those complaints outstanding or doesn't investigate them in a timely fashion, that should be an immediate red flag for you that there's something at a cultural level that may not be right with that. So Bron, what did you want to add to that slide? Because I think we're going to questions after this.
No, one more. But anyway, that's okay. But
Yep.
so what I thought was interesting is that the standard says, obviously, risk manage fraud. So identify, assess, control, etc. All the various types of fraud events that could impact your organisation. And in that PwC report I referred to earlier in the presentation, 63% of all Australian businesses reported that they don't do a formal risk assessment for fraud, either internal or external. So I thought that was a really interesting stat, that we've got, over half of our businesses, they probably don't even have it on their risk register, let alone doing any sort of risk assessment for it. So again, it's that message of, we think that this can't happen to us, we don't want to acknowledge it. So I think even understanding that the risk of fraud can occur, and then what might the various scenarios be that could lead up to that for us in our businesses. So when it comes to the actual standard itself, I'm less cynical than James. I actually really like the standard, so I've read it a few times now. And so I thought it was actually really simple to read and really easy to follow, which a lot of them aren't. It is suitable for all organisations, large and small, and specifically also references not-for-profits as well. So it's suitable for large corporates, it's suitable for small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really comprehensive. It does cover both internal and external fraud and corruption, and it does provide those examples of what it could look like. So in the appendix, it actually has examples of external fraud and it lists them all. Then examples of corruption and lists them. Then it has examples of internal fraud and lists them. So this will help you, if you're going to undertake a fraud risk assessment, those bits of information are going to help you identify what could happen in your organisation. So I really like that. I thought that was really comprehensive.
Cryptojacking, that's all I have to say. It shows you that we've hit 2021 when we've got an Australian standard referring to cryptojacking and the use of computer equipment of the target organisation to mine cryptocurrency. It just, as soon as I read it, it made me laugh. I know I shouldn't.
I just went into denial about that. So
yeah.
But apart from the crypto stuff, there is a lot of good information in there. So we talked earlier in the presentation about organisations needing to have prevention strategies for fraud and then early detection systems. So if something's starting to go awry, you've got some sort of early detection system in place. And then if fraud does happen in your organisation, an effective response procedure. So this standard actually goes through that ABC, prevention, early detection, effective response, and actually tells you then how you can do that. So it actually steps you all the way through all of the things you need, and it explains how to establish a fraud and corruption control system for your organisation. And then, as James said, in the last appendix, there's actually key risk indicators for organisations that you can use to monitor and report on internal fraud, external fraud and corruption. So look, I actually thought it was a really good standard. I thought it was really easy to follow and probably one of the better ones that I've come across.
Okay, all right, let's just do a couple of quick straw polls and then we'll go to some open discussion, because as always, we want to hear from you guys. So if you're not already back on Menti, if you can jump on to Menti, and that slide should pop up for you. And we'd love to just get a straw poll in terms of how well do you think your current organisation prevents fraud and corruption? Obviously, it's purely qualitative, purely self-reporting. What Menti will do is it'll aggregate our average out of the group. Okay, that's interesting. That's higher than what I would have expected. What about you, Bron?
Yeah, I actually thought that's pretty good, actually. So just before we move on to the next question, does anyone want to share why you think that? Because that's higher than I thought it was going to be. Would anyone like to share why you think your organisation does things particularly well in terms of preventing fraud and corruption? You might have to unmute yourself.
I'm happy to come in first there.
Okay, good on you, Chris.
The challenge for law firms is we just have a big trust account. So
yeah,
a lot of that payment, double checking, accounts can't leave. We have to double check every single invoice that comes across. I don't think I'd be talking out of school to say we have already had attempted attacks at our trust account. They have fortunately been picked up because of the measures we have in place. So, there is a little bit of confidence there that we are doing the right things. But I think law firms and real estate agents, because we have money sitting in trust, are just open for that sort of fraud.
And who's going to notice it missing, really? I mean, is anyone going to notice? No.
It's just a bit here and there. What's 100,000 between friends, right?
That's right. That's right.
Put a bet on, and you'll double your money.
Oh, exactly right.
Just going to pop over to Macau and double it, and I'll be back this afternoon.
Exactly right. Slot it back into the trust account. No one saw anything.
No one will miss it. Does anyone else want to share why they think their organisation might do well in terms of preventing fraud and corruption?
Happy to share.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
Well, we've unfortunately been the subject of one cyber attack.
Yep.
Fortunately, my husband and I are both completely paranoid about, who's my business partner, about data backups and whatever. So we carry around a whole heap of little black external drives. And that's what saved us. So we're completely paranoid about that. As far as financial systems, I've been working on that for about 15 years. I guess the one thing loophole that we haven't closed is the use of assets. We're not really monitoring that, say, vehicles on weekends and that thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks. All right. Well, we might jump on and do another
Next
quick
one.
straw poll. Yeah. So again, if everyone wants to just grab the smartphone and bust it out.
Okay. Your organisation understands the need to acknowledge and manage fraud risk. Agree or disagree? Oh. You've taken us off, James.
Yeah. Am I back?
You are now.
Yep.
Okay. Does anyone want to talk to us if your organisation has actually, or have you been through the process of undertaking a fraud risk assessment in your business? Has anyone sat through that or had that conversation with your leadership or management teams at least? Yes, no. I thought maybe you would have because that's a pretty good result on acknowledging and managing fraud risk. So I just thought we might have had a few people that have undertaken a risk assessment. Okay.
No, that's all right. Well, we might, I think that was the straw polls we were going to do today. Yep. So I think if that's the end of it, we can go, yep, we can stop the share and we can just go to some open discussion and questions. Yeah, because I think we'd probably love to hear from anyone if they've actually, Chatham House rules, if they're happy to share anything about, I guess, attempted incursions or successful incursions that they've had to navigate with their existing or prior businesses. But then also, as Bronwyn said, love to hear if anyone wants to share about the proactive stuff that they've done to actually, head this stuff off.
It's amazing to me the number of organisations, I guess, that do fall foul of these types of things. And I was in preparation for today doing a bit of a read around a small sporting organisation in South Australia who were taken in for a significant amount of money as it related to payment redirection. What happened was they had a contractor in and they were resurfacing all their netball courts and they were putting it up on social media. So they had a lot of stuff on social media about this. And then the fraudsters actually intercepted the invoice amounts and actually got the money redirected to their account. And the sporting company wasn't aware until the legitimate contractor contacted them and said, sorry, your invoices are still not being paid. And they said, well, we've paid them. They actually got paid last month or whatever. And when they backtracked through it, they realised that's what had happened. It was payment redirection fraud. And so, you know, obviously the sporting company and the contractor both lose out in this situation. So, and that was just one. This kind of stuff pops up all of the time in the papers. It's you know, unfortunately, it is on the rise and we see a lot of it.
Rupert?
Yeah, I was just going to share in the chat, the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, put out a little blog piece yesterday on some of the more audacious and ridiculous frauds they've seen from around the world in the past year or so. So it makes for an interesting read in terms of the creativity of your average fraudster. To your point about I think there is a danger in anti-fraud of getting a bit kind of myopic. Yeah, and you have, when, you know, as you know, in the fraud triangle, you have opportunity, rationalization and motive essentially for the reasons for people committing fraud. And I think what people often overlook is that they focus on the opportunity, that where can I put in physical or practical controls without necessarily thinking about the motives and also the rationalizations of the fraudsters. Because when you start to think of it as a human problem and how might somebody subvert that system and do some sort of red team work, that's when you can often start to come up with the more creative controls.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's a good insight. And I think for those that would remember Charles's presentation from last year, a lot of that stuff really heavily intersects with the whistleblower, creating the effective cultures for whistleblower programs and speaking up cultures to actually bloody work. Because I think, Rupert, you've probably seen them. It's great. They're often just nothing more than fantastic bits of shelfware. And it's like, I think you might have even said it before. Yeah, it's a bit like prison psychology. No one wants to rat out the boys or rat out their mates, that sort of thing.
But isn't it interesting though that when I was having a read of this, a lot of the information comes about as a result of tip-offs.
Yes, so I was going to say that the ACFE reports the nations that you quoted earlier, if you've got an effective whistleblower line, you're going to reduce the time taken to detect the fraud by half, and often the median loss by about the same amount as well. So it's pretty important. But so speak up lines, but there's two challenges to them. Firstly, people often get overcomplicated. So one of the things that I did a while back on LinkedIn was I just built a type form to show that you can very quickly create a reporting line. It doesn't need to be something you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on. You can do it for hundreds to get yourself started if you're a small organization. But the second point is about retaliation, and retaliation is the biggest deterrent, and retaliation is often very hard to monitor. So what I'm seeing the smarter organizations do is, once somebody speaks up and raises their hand about a potential issue, is they're appointed a case officer that sits outside the investigation team, and that case officer is often in HR or something that they can then go back to if at any stage, and then the subsequent sort of year or two they feel that they're being discriminated or pushed out the business, marginalized because they spoke up. So it's not good enough to just say that we have non-retaliation and we don't tolerate retaliation. You actually have to put practical steps in place if you want people to actually speak up.
Yeah, I think I immediately, I don't know, Brad or Craig, if you've got a perspective on this, being two mining colleagues in the room, I think about the practical realities of the way mine cultures work around that. And I immediately get filled with dread about the thought of, you'd get, no matter what you feel like might be in place to prevent that, it feels a bit like you'd end up becoming the social pariah, or sort of, quietly frozen out of the business for some reason. I don't know if that's accurate or not. Craig, have you got a perspective on that?
Yeah, actually, the company I work for now has just had a very large fraud case. So there's millions of dollars involved. It's not just like a few. It probably will get a movie made out of it one day. So the federal police have actually been undercover working at one of the Western operations, and there was bikie gangs involved, drugs and some other undesirable things. It was a huge fraud case, and it still hasn't come out. I'm actually surprised it's not in the media at the moment. That's one aspect. I guess back to, I agree, Rupert's, the whistleblower thing is very good. The hard thing is, I guess, depending on the culture, you've got to have the right culture for it. I've seen a colleague lose his role because someone thought it was a great idea to use the whistleblower line to try and dob in something extremely minor, which led to a very senior person exiting a business in a mining industry in Queensland. But there's pros and cons for it, but I guess it's how it's applied. I think, sorry, what was the gentleman's name in Switzerland that had that? That was a really good...
Charles.
Yeah, so Charles's presentation back then, I got a lot out of it. I thought it was really good, yeah.
And Craig, without sort of letting too much away, and obviously it's quite sensitive, but the current incident that you're dealing with in your business, was that collusion between internal and external resources? Yeah. So for something that big, it involved insider information to external bodies? Yeah.
But still, like, you got to ask, how can, and there's some senior people in the company that are frustrated, like this has happened under their nose, on their watch sort of thing. Like this is millions and millions of dollars worth going on. There was equipment getting booked out that wasn't on site and hired.
Asset misappropriation.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I was thinking about, Craig, even in a more practical sense, back in the old Chain Valley days, was it the bikies that stole the Merlot and drove it up the street one Saturday night or something like that through the middle of Budgie Boy or something along those lines? Like,
the bikie gang took the, it's like a telehandler, like call it a Ford forklift, and burn it out. They were stealing, the root cause of that was people stealing cables. So we had a lot of issues with people stealing copper cables. And it still goes on now, but you ring the police and it's quite frustrating. Like that's just minor to them. Like each cable is probably worth, a minor cable is $10,000. A HT cable would be worth in the order of $80,000. People steal them and go and cut them up just to get the copper out of it.
Because it's not just cash that people are after. There's actual other sort of equipment and resources and those sorts of things that are very attractive depending on your industry and your organisation. So when you're doing your risk assessment, these are the things to think about. It's not just cash or cards or those sorts of things. Don't just think money. Think about your resources and your assets and what have you got. I mean, I think, James, you shared with me theft of explosives and things is something that's, you know, quite prominent. And I'm sure, Craig, that's probably something you're familiar with.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of theft of explosives. That's happened a lot.
And then I think if you broaden that as well, because obviously the standard, especially these days, the world lives and breathes on intangible assets in the name of intangible IP, that can become extremely attractive to target as well. And obviously, I think last year we talked about the issue where there was state-sponsored theft of, you know, industrial espionage, that sort of thing related to patents and designs. And certainly, when I worked at Peabody, that there was a genuine incursion in relation to that to steal IP. And I think no doubt that will only become more sophisticated, because I think at last statistics, I think the balance has moved totally like that. And someone might know the stats off the top of their head that the majority of value in the global economy now is actually in intangible assets, not intangible assets. And so therefore that means that IP, copyright, all this stuff that whizzes around electronically, that's got a huge theft value on it as well. So Theo, you got, I know you're the privacy guru. Have you got a perspective on this, or something you'd like to share from that sort of tech sector space that you may have come across in the last few months at all?
I mean, we haven't come across anything like this, which is good. We've got
that you know
general
of
controls that I know of. We do have general controls in place though, and it's something we do monitor, which is, I think, positive. So I think, but I guess I was just thinking about like intangible assets and, you know, the way that steal them and how easy it is. Coming from the university sector, we see this all the time. Like,
yeah,
universities collaborate with other parties, and then somehow a valuable piece of background IP, which is contributed as part of a project, gets pocketed away and utilized for other stuff. And then there's a, oh my God, they've breached our IP, or they've done all this, and this piece is taken. So that becomes quite interesting. Obviously an external piece of fraud there. But yeah, I think this is interesting as well from like a, what controls do you have in place from a financial perspective, like what checks you have in place from a procurement policy perspective as well, like, what checks and balances are in place to ensure that people aren't purchasing weird things, or is there a process around that? And, do approve, like, purchases of a particular level have to go to a certain level before it can actually be done. So, tying this in with delegations as well is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So,
who's got delegated authority to do what, and do you make it tighter the higher you go in terms of dollar value? Do you have tighter systems and that sort of stuff in place? So you're not so worried about $20 out of petty cash, but if it's 200,000 for something, then you want to make sure things are pretty tight.
Exactly. So having appropriate controls for things like that.
And that's that staff training too that sort of James talked about earlier, about not only training on the processes about how we do things, but it's also creating expectation in the organisation around things like conflict of interest, collusion, all of those sorts of things. You want to make sure that, people understand how all of those things work and what's expected of them. And then, because whilst training in itself is not going to necessarily stop people from doing something, it creates an awareness, and it lets people know that this is in this organisation, we've got it on our radar, it's on our register, and here's what we think and here's what we do. So it's that kind of, like, at least it brings it to the front of mind for people, I guess, when you're running training and regular training on those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely.
I'll tell you really, sorry, Rupert.
No, go.
I was just going to tell you a really quick story which ties into delegations and approvals. I was working in a private bank in London in 2005, 6 and 7. And it was called Schroders. I don't know if anyone knows Schroders. We set up the banking system, and we were looking at the delegations and approvals, and they had a very manual system. So you actually had to go and physically check the signatures of people. And I was training a 17-year-old young guy on the process the systems we just put in, and there's a clearance folder, and we had to approve a $200,000 check that came through from America, and there was no proof. The systems weren't lining up, so I actually bounced the check. I rejected it. But it was interesting to see that there was so much pressure on people putting on me to, I had a couple of calls from up above.
Yeah.
I didn't know who the owner of the check was at the time. And anyway, I found out that afternoon that it was Bruno Schroeder, the owner of the bank, trying to put a deposit on a boat in
there
America.
Goes the Christmas bonus.
Well, I said to the guys above, I said, well, make sure that there's approval in the folder where it's supposed to be, and tell Bruno that his systems are actually working, because it could have been so easy just to go, I'll approve it.
Yeah. But it's really interesting, isn't it? People think that if they agitate or often not in this case, but intimidate, agitate, get angry, it will force you to make a decision because you're trying to avoid the conflict. And that intimidation is a large part of this kind of fraud.
Well, I can only imagine if that was a day later or 2 days later, or even the next week when I wasn't there and the 17-year-old was there going through the process. I mean, I think there were some other backups at the time, but there was so much pressure on people manually trying to get things through a system. So I was thinking that the more you automate, it could be better. However, as long as no one's hacking into your system, you're still going to have the same sort of issue.
Yeah. And I think that's why, when you think about these KRIs, key risk indicators, because they're forward facing, they're not always, you know, hardcore quantified, you know, accounting style numbers that we know are to be absolutely accurate. But I think the point is that you want to, and I think we talk about that in general with key risk indicators. They're like the orange warning lights. You know, they're a bit like oh, hang on, something just doesn't feel quite where it needs to be here. And certainly we found consistently with any risk management framework, when you get those KRIs right, it actually gives you that opportunity to proactively jump or to respond to something. And I think there's I know Dave would know it because you're the not-for-profit finance expert, but the ISO guidance, like the Australian standard in relation to not-for-profits in that space talks about, you know, it's about being able to predict problems before they arise. And I think that's what a good KRI can actually do, is
early
give you that
detection
flashing
systems.
Yeah, just go, oh, hang on a second, that's just not right. Let's do something about it now rather than just wait and see. But I think about, you know, love to hear from you, Brad, if you feel like sharing. But I think about back in my days as a graduate, working in mining, there was exactly what Craig shared, and probably what, you know, all of us have seen, where there's pressure put on you by more senior people going, just do this, just approve it, just do it. You know, I just need you to do this now. And I think there's times, certainly not in a financial fraud sense, but I think that's a hard position to be in when you're a younger or a more junior person in the organisation. It seems like these, you know, there's been a big trend with that to try and, like you said, Bron, just yell and scream and make as much noise, and hopefully that'll just blag your way through. So yeah.
Now, sorry, Rup, we interrupted you before. Did you want to add to that?
I was just going to ask, I mean, your point about sort of training, as it also increases the perception of detection, which therefore can bring down risk. But the two of the other things, because the standard basically is prevent, detect, respond, right? And so I think prevention, people, you know, assessments, training, response, we talked about the whistleblowing, but it's the detection bit that I'm most interested in, because there's the human and there's the numerical side to it. So I was just curious, is anyone here working for organizations that use data analytics as detection? Would be question one. And question two would be, is there any profiling? Because we know that there's certain indicators of fraudsters. So like, for example, they don't take much leave, they don't share much work, they're in roles where there's not much job rotation, they might be living beyond their means, etc. So there are these sort of detection mechanisms. But does anyone use them? Because they tend to, in my experience, the detection bit tends to be the weakest in most organizations. They have to do the training.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I was going to say, Rupert, I think you described me.
We're profiling you, are you, Theo?
Well, I was going to say, Brad. You sure that we didn't just perfectly describe Jason Chapman? Was who I immediately thought of. One of our.
I still talk to Chappie. He's pretty high up in Downer now.
Yeah,
that's me. I haven't had holiday for 2 years, but due to COVID, I can't go anywhere. I'm stuck here.
Certainly in corporate banking, we used to use, and there was absolute mandatory requirements for leave, that you had to be away from your job on leave for at least 2 consecutive weeks every year. And that actually they would issue reports for that sort of thing. And the concept was that you could hide things for a little while, but you can't hide them for longer periods of time. And that usually for 2 weeks, someone else will come in and take over your job. So it's not a pair of eyes on your job. There's absolutely mandatory 2 weeks. You know, they just didn't want the leave accruals to get up, I guess. So, but 2 weeks out of your job every year. And there was the fraud team there used to use the whole, anyone who comes in on weekends, doesn't let anyone take control of their job, takes on extra tasks. All of these things were kind of, I guess, indicators that they used to look at.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things.
Yeah. No, you go, Dave.
Really quickly, another incident down at a big club in Sydney was quite a few years ago. We knew something was happening. I was an auditor at the time, and obviously dealing a lot with cash. And we knew that something was happening, and we thought we knew who it was we profiled the guy. He hadn't taken leave. People in the bar where a lot of casuals were afraid of speaking up. So we actually did that. We said he's got to take leave. And when he did, we found out that there was some major issues. And we ended up, you know, finding the evidence. When he came back, they planted a few different things. I think they marked some cash. I'm not sure exactly how it was done, but they marked some cash, and he had, you know, his hands all over it. So in that situation, they weren't sure how much money had been taken. They could only base it on what evidence they had. But he was there for over 10 years, so there was a lot of money that went out that wasn't. Yeah. It was that cagey, and the systems that he had, that it wasn't able to be picked up that well.
Wow. It's interesting that you'd say that over a long period of time. I think when we delivered the internal fraud topic last October, we talked about that kind of fraud occurring in two ways, and we were calling it either the slow burn or the big bang. So the slow burn is, I'll take $20 and I'll just see, oh, no one noticed, so now I'm going to take 50. And, oh, no one knows, so now I'm going to do it every fortnight. Now I'm doing it every week. So it's that slow drain that comes out. And the other one I've seen, of course, is I'll take 100,000 and maybe no one will even really notice. So, yeah. And so, no, I was just going to loop back. So, Brad, just coming back to you for a second, Brad. So you guys have been locked in Asia for the last 2 years, have you? Like, haven't been able to move around at all? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, we got locked down. We got locked down here at the beginning of 2019, where we can't get expats in or out. So that obviously applies to me. And of course, a lot of the expats that had gone never got back. So we've had to stay here and persevere with it, I guess, and just go. Look, yeah, and we'd like to get back, and we're trying to get back, but there's no point in coming back at the moment while the place is locked down. I can't visit anyone, so I can't come down and visit you and get some of those beers back that you kind of That's in relation to all of this fraud and corruption. I mean, we would have seen some of this over the years. I mean, a famous case in Queensland was a very, very big agricultural concern where the actual people, there was absentee owners. So the people on the property were sending, 20 or 30 B doubles of, beef to the abattoirs, once they were mustering and things like that. But what they were doing, they were sending a lot of them to their own private abattoirs, and they got away with that for many, many years. I remember one site we were at, there was a maintenance manager. He had a whole truck full of fuel delivered to his farm. That was quite good. A lot of this stuff here is crossover too with like just plain simple stealing. We've dealt with a lot of fuel stealing over the years. I know that. I remember guys at one of the sites, some people came to site and they actually went to the trouble of getting inducted and drove out with 3 skid steers.
Well, they're stealing. They didn't want to get an injury, right?
They were in high vis, and there was security. Went to the security hut. They got inducted. They checked all of their credentials and such, and they just said, "We're here to pick up some skid steers," and which they did. Picked up 3 and drove out. So said, well, what happened to the skid steers?
Sorry, that's not
having said that,
it's not funny. It's not funny. No.
Well, it was at the time. I thought it was pretty funny.
Collect some skid steers.
Here we have some kind of different issues. Mongolia has been put on the banned list for money laundering and such. So a lot of the stuff here around approvals, around dealing with the government over anything, comes with a kind of threat to us that they'll try and offer bribes and stuff like that. And just getting things done is very difficult. So you pretty much start from the position of, you're dealing with the kind of, although now I've got to say this in the defence of the Mongolian government is that they're spending a lot of money. They've got a special unit set up to deal with corruption and that kind of thing. So that's all, getting taken care of, but it's slow. And listen, this kind of stuff will be around forever and a day. People misappropriating or stealing from employers, and where does it start and where does it finish? Everyone kind of, I guess, gets away with a bit from time to time. And you're right, during lockdown, people have got themselves into a habit of not coming to work. Whereas only 2 years ago, I mean, if you didn't come to work, you got to visit the HR department. Whereas now, they just don't come to work. Who knows what they're doing? If they were smart, they'd be doing a second job. Well, I mean, who's to say I'm not working for Rio Tinto on the side if I'm working from home? Or consulting some other fashion or who knows, landscaping my yard. I mean, I don't know that that's going on.
Yeah, misappropriation of assets, including time.
They're getting paid to work for a company, but because they don't come to work and do a few emails a day and a couple of phone calls, but what else are they doing? Could they be doing on the side? I don't know.
I think that's a good point, certainly about that. Yeah, people doing all this sort of side hustling, and we've got 2 or 3 colleagues in our network that have started side hustles during COVID that for different reasons have now either partially or totally transitioned into their full-time jobs. And so I think, whether that introduces the question in terms of, were they misappropriating previous employers' tangible or intangible assets while they're growing their business on the side? But I mean, that's, really good point. And look, appreciate the perspective from sunny downtown Mongolia as well, Brad. It's really interesting for us to hear about what's going on up in -10 degrees Celsius or whatever it is at the moment. So
personally, I've loved it. It's the best place I've ever worked.
Great. Okay. Awesome.
With challenges, but I love it here, and I'll be sad when I have to come back. But I will be back at some stage.
Yeah, nice. Well, look, we've pretty much shot the clock, folks. So I was going to say, unless anyone's got any sort of closing remarks or blindsides to throw at us, we might call it quits. And as usual, it's been a really great, entertaining conversation. That's what we're here to do.
Hopefully everyone's enjoyed some of the learnings as well as the fun, and raising awareness of that standard. And like I said, I actually think it's a really good standard. So get a copy and have a look at it.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, defensibility really, isn't it, Bronwyn? And we are saying this, Chris, in the true legal definition of the word, that you want defensibility when something goes wrong and someone criticizes you. You can't go wrong if you're mapping your organization's processes to a recognized standard code of practice, or
you don't want it happening on your watch, to use Craig's words. So,
any help we can get is welcome. So
that's right. Excellent. All right. Well, look, thank you very much, folks. Hope you have a great afternoon wherever you are, and we'll look forward to seeing you again for. I think we're going to call it quits after November for the year, Bron, aren't we? We're not going to do a December event, but then we'll be back with something.
Oh no, we could just Zoom drinks.
I was going to say, shouldn't the December event be somewhere?
Yeah. Oh, well, hopefully a few of us are in Newcastle. I'm hopeful by then at least we can bloody well catch up and have a real beer. So we'll see.
In real actual, I've forgotten what that's like.
Yeah. So right.
Okay, guys.
All right. Thanks, folks. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Thanks, mate. See ya.
Hey, take care.
Thanks, Bron. Bye.